two presenters in it. The first presenter is Alexandr Osipian, who's an associate professor of history and cultural anthropology in the Department of History and Cultural Studies at Kramatorsk Institute of Economics and Humanities in Ukraine. And the title of his presentation, you can also see on the screen, Ukrainian Piedmont versus Industrial Part of Russia, Regional Exceptionalism as a Resource of Political Mobilization and Electoral Manipulation in Ukraine 2004-2012. Alexander, the floor is all yours, and I suppose we will have two presentations and then open the floor for discussions. Please.
Thank you. This paper examines the roles that the two regions, Galicia or Galiciana and Donbass, play in contemporary Ukrainian politics. The main attention will be given to the exceptionalist images of self and of other. This paper will address the following questions. Why exactly Galicia and Donbass have been two extreme poles when it comes to their electoral preferences? How are regional stereotypes of the perception of self and other connected to the different imperial legacies? How regional differences were used to manipulate electorate after independence of Ukraine was proclaimed, and in particular after the so-called Orange Revolution and in future election campaigns. My hypothesis is that in post-Soviet countries, new true history or recovered old true history was used by new old political elites as a substitute for the lacking ideology. There, history became a quasi-ideology. In Ukraine, particularly after 2004, regional diversities were used to divide society and to manipulate its electoral preferences. I hope that you can see on this screen a map of presidential elections in Ukraine in 2004, and the main concentration of Viktor Yushchenko's supporters in orange color is in three oblasts known as Galicia, and the main base of support of Viktor Yanukovych, that is blue color, easternmost part of Ukraine, in two oblasts known as Donbass. Both regions gave to their favorite more than 90% of the votes. The same trend maintained during next presidential elections in 2010, when Galicia supported Yulia Tymoshenko, while Donbass voted again for Viktor Yanukovych. This almost unanimous electoral support of a certain candidate in Galicia and Donbass is more evident in comparison with other orange and blue regions. None of the candidates was able to get 90% of support, and only in a few cases 70 or 80% in a certain region. According to Harvard professor Timothy Colton, who analyzed all 5 presidential campaigns in independent Ukraine, the west section of Ukraine has come out against the south and east all 5 times. Results like this raise sobering questions about Ukraine's vaunted pluralism. If the voting statistics are to be believed, its political multiculture at the national level has rested on a foundation consisting to a considerable extent of political monocultures at the subnational level. In the political technologies of electoral mobilization, in particular starting from 2004, juxtaposition of west and east of Ukraine has been presented namely as juxtaposition of these two extreme poles, that is Donbas and Galicia. The majority of politicians and election managers prefer to use Galicia and Donbas as paradigms and concepts of West and East precisely with the content. This helps making the whole confrontation more prominent and hence more effective, and facilitates manipulations of the electorate and voters' opinions. Both Galicia and Donbas, as well as other parts of Ukraine, were sculptured by the different historical experiences. Galicia includes three oblasts, Lvivska, Ternopilska and Ivano-Frankivska, with a total population around 6 million. Galicia was part of Polish kingdom from mid-14th century till the late 18th century, then under Habsburg rule till the end of the First World War, and in Polish Republic in interwar period. Under Habsburg rule, Ukrainians were allowed to develop distinctive Ukrainian identity while maintaining a loyalty to the Habsburgs in order to counterbalance the growing Polish nationalism in Galicia. After transformation of Habsburg Empire into dual Austro-Hungarian monarchy in 1867, Galicia obtained regional autonomy with Polish domination in regional politics, economy, education and culture. Local Polish political activists proclaimed Galicia Polish Piedmont, seeing it as the center of Polish national revival in comparison with other Polish lands being under political and cultural oppression in German and Russian empires. The Ukrainian national movement in Galicia was shaped under the conditions of competing with stronger Polish national movement. That is why Ukrainian activists borrowed the metaphor of Piedmont as well as many other elements of nation building from their Polish competitors. Famous Ukrainian historian Mikhailo Hrushevsky, one of the founding fathers of modern Ukrainian nation, described the role of Galicia in Ukrainian national revival in an article entitled Ukrainian Piedmont and published in 1906. According to Hrushevsky, who was professor at the Lviv University, during the last decade of the 19th century, Galicia became center of economic activity and plays the role of cultural arsenal towards Ukrainian lands in Russia. Since there, in Galicia, were produced and improved facilities of national cultural and political civic revival of Ukrainian people. During First World War, Galicia was the main battlefield between Austrian and Russian armies. After the failed attempts to create Western Ukrainian People's Republic in 1918 and 1919, Galicia fell back under the Polish rule. The notion of Ukrainian Piedmont was enforced after foundation of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists in 1929. This organization, led by Stepan Bandera, was acting radically against oppressive politics of Polish government. After the unsuccessful proclamation of independent Ukraine in Lviv in June 30, 1941, and in October 1942, Ukrainian insurgent army was created fighting against the Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union until the early 1950s. Thus, in the center of the concept of Galicia as Ukrainian Piedmont, there is an image of the region as the main center of the national liberation movement and of victimized heroism of Galician Ukraine. efforts were made to turn the positive image of Soviet past into were quickly marginalized, completely vanishing from the official politics of memory as well as from the new historical narratives created on the basis of pre-revolutionary historiography and narratives written by the Ukrainian diaspora. Yes, thank you. It could explain why in the early 1990s residents of Donbass still perceived their region not as part of Ukraine, but as equal to it. Later, inhabitants of Donbass included their region into the imaginative geography of Ukraine, not as ordinary region among many others, but as the main part of Ukraine. Party of power, now the party of regions, readily takes advantage of divisive issues during elections. Now we can see efforts of President Yanukovych to reintroduce President Kuchma's in-between model and to use it in the parliamentary elections in 2012 in autumn and presidential elections in 2015. There are certain changes in political technologies of juxtaposition of East and West, which could be used by the ruling party of regions in the forthcoming elections. Donbass is the native region of President Yanukovych, and in minds of his supporters and opponents, this region is closely associated with the very political image of Yanukovych. Yanukovych tries to represent himself as the center of stability between the two extreme political poles, that is, nationalist and communist, between Bandera and Stalin. In order to win the votes of the moderate part of Tymoshenko's former electorate. Thus, Donbass is represented as a region of political stability and economic development. The role of East opposing to the nationalist West is now being played by Odessa, Crimea, in particular city of Sevastopol, Dnipropetrovsk and Zaporizhia. And I have different cases, but I have no time. Thank you for your attention, and thank you for this great opportunity to present my paper, this workshop. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Hopefully in this lecture we will have a chance to refer to the specific cases, but we are on a very, very tight schedule, and we have to be disciplined. Our next presenter is Tarik Amar, who is assistant professor of history at Columbia University, and Tarik did have a chance to join us on the trip to the Borderlands of the past. Also, he asked you yesterday, but I'm sure get acquainted with him in the meantime. The title of his presentation is Borderlands of the Past, Lviv's Soviet History of the Present.
First of all, thank you very much thanks to the organizers for inviting me to this. Secondly, some introductory remarks. What I'm going to read out is an extremely condensed version of a chapter of a book that I'm writing. So I have to say right at the beginning that I think it speaks to questions of temporality, time, teleology. It also speaks, in a Soviet context, of course, to questions of what I call heterochronia, which is not the same as heterochronia. Heterochronia is much more a pluralistic notion, implying that different times, different senses of time or temporalities, of making sense of historical time, coexist. What I mean by heterochrony is much more akin to the usage of the term that implies that the sense of historical time is not autonomous. It is actually coming from somewhere else. So that, as a very general frame of what I'm going to speak about, it's also based on a case study on very close reading of documents and published sources and official discourse. And much of that, most of that, the vast majority of that, I cannot reproduce in a short paper like this. So you have to bear with me if this is at once very microscopic, very much the outcome of a local study, and at the same time may appear also very sweeping, especially because the basis that's behind this is not perhaps always obvious, and I hope we can then talk about it. So let me read this out. This paper addresses two questions. One is general, and the other is more specific. And the specific one, I should say, is sort of nested within the general one. The general problem is actually very, very simple and very expected. It's the construction of a local past to fit the Soviet post-World War II present in the city of Lviv, which became the center and urban symbol, or in late Soviet usage, actually the leader of Western Ukraine, and was, as you all know, probably conquered for the Soviet Union and for Soviet Ukraine only as a result of the Second World War. It also became the center of a Soviet project to remake it into a Soviet as well as very Ukrainian city. One really has to understand that Lviv was not Russified. Lviv was made Ukrainian and Sovietized at the same time. The second question is much more specific, I think. It's about a particular part of this construction of a new past. And I have called that, and by borrowing a phrase but not its meaning, a Soviet history of the present. That is, a specific set of narratives linking the past of Lviv and thus Western Ukraine, not just to a Soviet Marxist account of human history, but to the specific ethos and teleology of the Soviet phenomenon, rooted, after all, in a revolution in an empire which Lviv had not been part of when it happened, only to be conquered, as we've already mentioned, later as a result of the Second World War. Importantly, while Lviv thus missed the origins of the Soviet phenomenon, its joining it was directly linked to an event which in the post-war period would turn out no less central to Soviet narratives of self-understanding. And that's, of course, with this event I refer to the Soviet reading of the Second World War, which is the Great Fatherland War. And as you probably know from the literature, the Great Fatherland War after the war becomes a myth, certainly not less important than the Great October Revolution. Now I leave out most of the introduction concerning Lviv and address directly what was then done in terms of history. The Soviet post-war construction of new pasts for Lviv can be understood in the complex, it can be understood as part of the process of Borderlands Sovietization, which produced both Soviet and Ukrainian identities. Regarding the making of Lviv's past in general, in Soviet narratives, the World War II liberation, as it was called, and modernization of the city's present, with its purported legacies of backwardness, foreign occupation, including in the Soviet reading centuries of Polish and Habsburg rule, and social and national oppression, cleared a path to Soviet as well as Ukrainian future. The Sovietization of the past, moreover, was no less important than that of this present and this future. At the same time, since Sovietization in Lviv was inextricably linked to a Soviet version of Ukrainization, the suppression or marginalization of other national identities and histories, mainly those, in this case, of Poles and Jews, who of course were the majority of the population and really shaped it before the war, was an integral part of this process. The Soviet efforts to introduce and produce a Ukrainian identity and past for Lviv, and also a past that would then be fit for the Soviet Union, were extremely important in this regard too. However, they were complicated by the fact that they had to be made in direct competition with the claims and heritage of integral Ukrainian nationalism, traditionally, as we've just heard, centering on Western Ukraine, as well by what was in effect a fundamental double ambiguity inherent to the Soviet project itself. What did it mean to be Ukrainian and Soviet, and more complicated, what did it mean to be Ukrainian from Western Ukraine, what was called in Soviet terminology a local, and simultaneously a Soviet Ukrainian. It was exactly within these expanding and contradicting spaces marked out by these particular questions that any forging of a past combining the Soviet, the Ukrainian, and the local had to take place. Thus, in the post-war years, Lviv received a new past which united universally Soviet features with others locally specific in what was in effect a comprehensive work in progress, a sort of Gesamtkunstwerk really, ending only when Soviet rule collapsed and leaving behind persistent legacies that are actually still with us. The second and more specific issue, as I explained in my introduction, reflects the fact that this emerging Soviet past for Lviv was not homogeneous. This is extremely important. It was actually a complex compound. Its structure and special intricacy were a result of Lviv's borderland position in space and of the point in Soviet teleological time when it had been joined to the Soviet experiment. A key feature of the Soviet retelling of the city's history was that it reached not only far into the pre-Soviet past, but also right into the Soviet present. And crucially, this was by no means simply due to the passing of time after 1939 or 1944 when the Soviets returned. The resulting Soviet history of the present was much more complex than simply the aging of the Soviet presence in Lviv. Instead, it established a distinct imaginary space in which phenomena occurring before 1939 or 44 were joined in a special relationship with the unfolding Soviet present. While all of Lviv's past was subjected to a kind of Soviet socialist reconstruction, the past of the Soviet present was different again, forming a special liminal area between the pre-Soviet and the Soviet. Accordingly, despite the application to Lviv of universal Soviet Marxist periodizations into feudalism, capitalism, and the Soviet era, and you will find these in Soviet books about Lviv, the city's remake past was fundamentally really divided between its pre-Soviet part and the past of the Soviet present itself. And the dividing line between these essential epochs, which were construed as exhaustive, as encompassing all of Lviv in time, and also as radically different from each other, was not thin and sharp, but thick and meaningful, marked by the years 1917, representing, of course, the Great October Revolution, the Bolshevik Big Bang, if you want, 1939, standing for liberation and unification with Soviet Ukraine, and 1944 and 1945, confirming the claims of 1939 through the Great Fatherland War triumph over Germany in general, no less than through the re-liberation, as it were, of Lviv in particular. So in the following, after a very short sketch of those narratives that constituted, as it were, the pre-Soviet and simple past, I want to focus on several key components of the unsimple and essential stories which lay across this dividing line, a borderland, as it were, in historical time, and bound Lviv not merely into Soviet Marxist history of humanity, but into the specific end of history that had begun in 1917 in the Russian Empire. So by the 1980s, when the second and last Soviet history of Lviv came out, the pre-Soviet past began with prehistoric settlements on the city side and its early development in the medieval Harlitz-Volhynian Principality, claimed to have crucially prepared the ground for preserving the city's, quote, Eastern Slavonic character and ties with the Ukrainian as well as brotherly Russian and Belarusian peoples after a 14th century Polish conquest and the resulting, quote, yoke of foreign feudalists decried as having turned Lviv into a hub of Polish rule and Roman Catholic expansionism. Then you will see how Lviv's Orthodox Ukrainians, how Khmelnytsky's appearance in front of the gates of the city, and similar events, the rule of the Habsburgs after the partitions of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, are all built into in fairly predictable and really not, to be honest, very interesting ways into these types of narratives. And I'm going to leave out most of this and now going to talk about the way in which we actually see a much more interesting process when we come to the time roughly after 1917. The claims, you have initially claims for Lenin's pre-revolutionary influence, sometimes even for his presence in Lviv, which were false, but it's very interesting that they are made. And they actually mark the point at which you have inscriptions of Lviv's pre-1939, 44, 20th century history into what I call the telos of the Bolshevik Revolution. Then, its narratives included stories of the Interwar Communist Party of Western Ukraine, this is central, the KPZU, and of a communist underground in German-occupied Lviv, the so-called Narodная Gvardia imeni Ivana Franka, and then also of the Soviet equivalent of a martyr's cult built on the memory of a local communist writer, Yaroslav Falak, who is assassinated by Ukrainian nationalists in 1949. What I'm going to try to do here is use the time to talk at least about the KPZU and the Narodная Gvardia, and if we have enough time, we talk about the Alan story too. Now, the KPZU, repressed by the Stalinist leadership before the Soviet conquest of Western Ukraine, which happens in 1939, the repression happens in 1938, the KPZU came to represent treason and subversion. But with the Soviet acquisition of Western Ukraine, the latter needed a local revolutionary tradition to cloak the reality of what was really military conquest. Until 1956, there was a massive tension between this need and the continuing suppression of the KPZU's memory, and it remained unresolved. Between 56 and 63, however, what you have is that the KPZU is mostly, if never entirely, rehabilitated and assigned a leadership role in Western Ukraine's pre-1939 revolutionary tradition, its very own local revolutionary tradition. Its local veterans, those who were surviving by that time, were offered privileges and pensions and living space, as well as some public honors then. But bringing the KPZU back in from the code also required defining a special subordinate relationship between this local tradition and the Soviet master narrative of origins and legitimacy of the Great October Revolution. The memory of the KPZU, appropriately retold, had a unique potential to integrate Soviet Lviv and Western Ukraine into the Great October Revolution narrative. It would establish a link between local revolutionary traditions and the revolution in the empire. But this was also extremely difficult. Lviv had been beyond the direct territorial reach of the revolution. The KPZU first needed to be rehabilitated from the stigma of nationalism and treason imposed by pre-war Stalinist persecution. And moreover, the illegal interwar KPZU had not been a mass party, with membership peaking between 4 and 5,000 and fluctuating very strongly. The number of survivors, of course, was also small. Moreover, the KPZU's history had also remained marked by splits over the issue precisely of subordination to the Polish party to which it officially belonged. Since then, of course, the area in which it was active was part of Interwar Poland, and the position to take toward bourgeois Ukrainian nationalism. In addition, a majority of the KPZU had later sided with Ukrainization in Soviet Ukraine, even when the policy was abandoned and repressed there. And finally, the conflict over autonomy within the Comintern or subordination to the Polish Communist Party mirrored early attempts by purged Soviet Ukrainian communists to obtain an autonomous status for the Soviet Ukrainian communists and refuse subordination to the Russia-dominated Communist Party. So the KPZU was really charged with legacies that can hardly be digested. What was also at stake in the KPZU's first suppressed and recalled memory was a conflict between an all-Soviet order of revolutionary precedents and the legitimation of Soviet rule by local revolution. Soviet rule in Western Ukraine was legitimized by both a narrative of social and national liberation and increasingly by reference to a native pre-39 revolutionary movement in Western Ukraine itself. Yet the Soviet presidents demanded that the Great October Revolution was the basis of all other revolutionary movements. In that sense, it has often been stressed that Sovietization is somehow built on a replica model. But in fact, you cannot simply replicate, because the Soviet clearly has to be the first, as it were the unmoved mover, and no other movement in the peripheries can have precisely that quality. No less important, the Soviet suspicion of the KPZU also evoked the larger issues of the general role of locals. While this issue affected far more non- and anti-communists than communists in Western Ukraine, the KPZU veterans did have particular significance as locals have proven, if retrospectively temporarily denied communist loyalty. This went actually to the heart of Soviet legitimacy in this particular region. if even KPZU veterans had no place in the elites of Soviet Western Ukraine, then really the question was who did. And it's even worse than that. If others actually did have a place in the new Soviet elites, then that implied a question about what type of power Soviet power actually was. Did it want submission or loyalty, perhaps, by conviction, or did it want loyalty by adaptation and opportunism? The most articulate reconciliation of these contradictions, and it took years to work this out, in the need for local roots and Soviet predominance, even before '39, was actually achieved only in the form of memoirs. And the interesting thing is that other forms were tried but failed, and we can trace this very well in the documentation that we find in Kiev. The general synthesis, actually, of writing up a new story of the KPZU was never achieved. What you do find is a sort of Bildungsroman, which integrated local achievement and Soviet guidance through personalized narratives of development. While they, as it were, individualized KPZU, inscribed Western Ukraine into the Great October Revolution narrative, you then had a second phenomenon, which was the Narodnya Gvardia, we mentioned it at the beginning. That linked Lviv to a crucial element of the second Soviet core myth, the Great Fatherland War, because it provided the city with a story of a communist underground. Strongly exaggerating the significance of communism and popular resistance, it also had in common with the reconstruction of the KPZU that it marginalized to the point of exclusion everything that was not Ukrainian, with a partial exception for Russians. In the case of the Gvardia, this was even a double repression. It was even more complex. While its official narratives, mainly emerging after 1957, again very similar in terms of time to when the KPZU becomes an acute issue, formally acknowledged that it had been a multinational organization, they also heavily distorted its history to make it appear essentially Ukrainian, notwithstanding the fact that it had really been a branch of the Polish communist underground. We can see this very clearly in the evidence, until at least 1943. Moreover, the Gvardia story, exaggerated out of all proportions, also eclipsed what had been Lviv's far more numerous underground, and that, of course, was the Polish Delegatura and the Roma. In both cases, KPZU and Gvardia, this often come imposition of an official narrative that privileged Ukrainians and locals over Poles and Jews did come from the top. With the KPZU, it would have been impossible without Khrushchev's post-1956 experiment in blaming the past on others and loosening some constraints in the present. The Gvardia's rise to prominence was not as abrupt. After all, the Gvardia had never been anathematized like the KPZU. Its increased prominence, too, however, needed a central initiative to generally expand the retrospective ranks and narratives of anti-German underground resistance in Ukraine, which happened around 1960. In both cases, however, this narrative co-optation did not take place without conflicts. While these were complex, turning on issues of veracity, insider knowledge, personal scores to be settled, privileges, recognition in the present, they had in common that the role of locals remained contentious despite what amounted to a Soviet offer of unilateral, non-negotiable, yet substantial compromise. The veterans of both organizations never ceased to write letters of complaints and demands. And some of them are not just about material privileges, but very much about the history and the narratives. In fact, by readmitting the KPZU into official memory and boosting the position of the Gvardia, the Soviet authorities unwittingly created non-public yet real spaces in which the relationship between the universal claims and the local implementation remained subject to appeal, however not to negotiation. I'm not quite sure how much time do we have left?
About 7 minutes.
Oh, okay, then let's talk about Halanto. Writer and propagandist and exemplary local Yaroslav Halan was assassinated in 1949. His murder inaugurated a special local repression wave, also cooptation and propaganda wave, which targeted Ukrainian nationalism, youth, and the intelligentsia. In fact, it's the last Stalinist campaign in Lviv made specifically for Lviv. It's not the last Stalinist campaign, there are others, but it's the last one with a specific local profile. What happened next is that Halan came up for official glorification, and unlike with the KPSU and the Gvardia, it happened basically immediately, with the first steps coinciding with the post-assassination campaign in 1950-51 itself. However, even this murdered local on his way to what really turns into Soviet sanctification becomes a price, and he's fought over in hidden but very bitter struggles. In October 1953, Vilna Ukraina, that's a local newspaper in Lviv, article already presented the fully developed narrative of the emerging Halan cult, to subsequently change very little. Halan had died at the instigation of the Vatican and the Ukrainian nationalist, which is of course the Soviet version. His life had been a straight and narrow line of pro-Soviet and pro-Russian righteousness, starting in his childhood with his family's sympathy for Russia and persecution by, in this case, the Habsburgs. Seeking refuge in the Russian Empire, young and precocious Halan learned Russian, fully understood the importance of Russian culture as well as Russian-Ukrainian ties, and witnessed the Great October Revolution. Returning to interwar Poland, he suffered from discrimination and turned into a communist, struggling for social justice against Polish landowners and capitalists, and for national liberation and unification with Soviet Ukraine for Poland's Ukrainians. Finally, his journalism during the Great Fatherland War and his post-war reporting on German crimes had blended seamlessly into his post-war polemics against Ukrainian nationalists, the USA, Britain, the Vatican, and the Greek Catholic Church. However, the making of his legend was not peaceful at all. In 1953, writer Vladimir Belyayev complained officially about his Lviv Writers' Union colleagues Petro Koslianov and Yuri Melnichuk because they had severely criticized the first biography of Halan's work published in Lviv under the co-editorship of Belyayev himself. Belyayev, you have to know, was a quintessential Easterner, and he saw himself very much on a mission, a quasi-imperial mission, I would say, to Sovietize Lviv, while both Koslianov and Melnichuk were actually typical locals from Western Ukraine, if very co-opted locals. All three were important writers and functionaries. Koslianov was leading the Lviv Writers' Union branch, and Melnichuk actually directing the thick sort of intelligentsia journal Zhoten that the city had. They decried Belyayev's Knižočka, or little booklet, as rife not only with elementary mistakes of facts and language, but also with falsification, for its tendency to make out of Halan a revolutionary at any price, a Marxist, so to speak, already in his cradle. Having 12-year-old Halan, already well versed in Lenin, Stalin, Gorky, Belinsky, Tolstoy, and others, made the work look silly, explaining the American failure to attack the Soviet Union by Wall Street's lack of interest in war was also wrong, but restrained the imperialists was, of course, Soviet might. Belyayev, in turn, accused Koslianov and Melnichuk of sinister and actually highly incriminating motives, including Ukrainian bourgeois nationalism and hypocrisy. He also denounced a general local Ukrainian lack of interest in Halan. Melnichuk was actually also the author of the first biography of Yaroslav Halan, published in 1951, on the occasion of a festival of Ukrainian culture in Moscow. Within weeks of Halan's murder, however, Belyayev too had urged the Central Committee in Kiev to increase what he called counter-propaganda, dramatically identifying himself as part of a group of writers remaining alive and stepping into the breach to replace their comrade fallen on what he called his battle by the pen post. His heroic intentions, he complained, however, were thwarted all too often by mundane obstacles to publishing. And by 1952, what you're clearly seeing here is that Halan's memory has turned into a resource that is being fought over between, on one side, a prominent writer who identifies very much as an Easterner, and on the other side, two prominent writers who are very clearly locals. While fighting over this resource seemed to be the immediate occasion for this conflict, there were also long-running tensions between Belyayev and his local writers' union colleagues. In a 1947 complaint to Moscow, Belyayev had not only denounced Halan himself, but also Koslianov, accusing him of leading a cabal of local writers, systematically blocking his own publications because he was an arrival from the East and was writing in Russian. This ends, interestingly enough, in an outcome that is publicly invisible. Halan's cult is very much established. By the 1960s, his apartment is turned into a museum. There is a special newspaper column. A lot of pioneer groups are named after him. And he gets one of the largest monuments in Lviv itself. But the interesting thing is that it is also split. Belyayev becomes really perhaps the main person profiting from it. He's the one who, in the 1970s, writes the script for a highly dramatic and, of course, very false biopic on Halan. But he's also the one who has to leave Lviv under the cloud of a very severe personal scandal in 1956. And by the 70s, you have Kozlanuk telling the OPCOM, the regional party committee, that, thank God, as he literally said, was a very good thing too. So what really happens here is that effectively and invisibly, the Halan legacy is divided. Belyayev gets most of it, but its local emanations remain in Lviv, and he has to leave. So if you look at these stories together, the Vadia, the KPZU, and the Halan myths were successful, actually, on their own terms, I would argue, creating an official memory which integrated the local and the universally Soviet for the decisively important part of the 20th century between the Russian Revolution and the Soviet reconquest of Lviv in 1944. The condition of this success, however, was the consolidation of a Soviet Western Ukrainian identity. And it's very important here to be clear, the Soviet Western Ukrainian identity, not just a Soviet Ukrainian identity. And that marks a major change in Soviet policy, which of course we are tracing here only through one aspect. There are many others to it, and we're not implying causality at this point. Once the KPZU had been recast as a leader of Western Ukraine's own revolutionary tradition, and the Khvadia purged of its Polish origins, and mostly actually its Jewish aspects too, so as to appear as an essentially Ukrainian organization, both the revolution and anti-German communist resistance were officially hailed and remembered achievements, which could now be shared by the local population. So taken together, you really have the production of what I called at the beginning the Soviet history of the presence, which provides Lviv and Western Ukraine with a recent past corresponding to both the time frames of living memory, and I think this is very important, and the telos of Soviet revolution and transformation. The KPZU narrative integrates Western Ukraine into the Soviet myth of origins, the Great October Revolution, while the Khvadia is an indispensable element of the myth of the Great Fatherland War, no less and perhaps even more important than the Great October Revolution. Halan becomes, I think, the figure who symbolizes more than anybody else the full commitment of the local in the Soviet case, and of course the way that his memory then is officially honored is also a way in which the local in the Soviet case is actually honored. The irony of this project of creating a local memory to match a Soviet Western Ukrainian present, however, lay not in its discontents. You can find plenty of inconsistencies, much more than we heard here, complaints, struggles, intrigues. The irony really, I think, lies in the fact that only those parts of these narratives survive the crisis of Soviet power in the late 1980s, which could be assimilated into a post-Soviet, nationally centered reading of Lviv's and Western Ukrainian history. The tales of the locals were actually reduced to their omissions, while the Khvadia, the KPZU, and Halan have been subjected to active forgetting on post-Soviet Lviv. Poles and Jews have simply remained forgotten. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And we'll just open the floor for discussions, comments.
I would like to pose several questions to the last presentation, which I think is very, very interesting. You did stress in your presentation that we have to seriously consider the original dimension of the Soviet nationality pose. Now, this for me comes as something new because historiographically, we think that there is a divide between the nationality policy, which is focused on language, ethnicity, and territory. And the territory is very individual, if you want, unique or exceptional, because it's connected with the ethnicity and it's connected with a particular settlement. And therefore, there was such a problem with the Soviet nationality policy as dealing with the diasporic population. They were trying to pin it to a particular individual territory, which is a homeland, right? So we have that on one hand, and the original policy, which we always, or historiographically, associate with a rival of the Soviet project of a nationality policy. The one connected to economic interests, the one that tries to undo the ethnic constitution, the one that has priorities of engineering, planning, etc. Now, we have, as I can see, we have an instrument, a frame in between of the national autonomies within the national republics. Now that did not happen to the Western Ukraine, right? It could have been possible to have an organizational design for a regional nationality policy, but that instrument was a national autonomy within the national republic. That didn't work out. So how do you see? How do you first? Do you want to address this larger question of regional versus nationality? Because speaking to the second theme of the seminar of the difference, the tension, the incommensurability between the regional and an ethnic territorial is exactly a problem of different castes or different planes of diversity that were manipulated, that were brought together and was a political resource and a political instrumentality in the hands of the Soviet power, which is not that well known, but I think should be more written about. Why didn't they go with the organizational design of a national autonomy within the nationally framed republic?
Let's collect more comments and questions.
I have a couple of questions for Alexandr. First question: how are these self-mythologies that you described? How are they articulated?
terms of elections, for example, did they participate at all, or what? It's probably for both of you, because it's Western. How it's integrated into Western identity, or not integrated at all.
Sergey, Vera, and Marina.
Maybe we should check.
Okay, that's fine. It's getting long, yes. Alexandr, would you like to begin?
Okay, thank you. Thank you for your questions. The first question was about how these self-mythologies, I prefer to use a term introduced by Anthony Smith as myth memories. These regional myth memories, how they are culturally manifested by the inhabitants of Donbass. In many ways, first of all, this extreme popularity of football or soccer club Shakhtar, which actually during the last 10 or 15 years became a new symbol of Donbass identity. And before, in a Soviet time, the symbol of Donbass identity was a real Shakhtar, that is a miner working in a coal mine. But now there is a shift in identity, and this football club Shakhtar is a substitute for real coal miners in Donbass identity. There are also different kinds of discussions in Donbass before and after every presidential and parliamentary elections, in newspapers, in online editions, forums, in internet, and oral conversation. And since I am living in Donetsk region for many years, I have an opportunity to listen and even sometimes to take part or even to provoke these discussions to get more information. And every time this juxtaposition of Donbass and Galicia is evident, and in particular these phobias or fears that Galicians can occupy the main administrative and economic positions in Donbass as well as in Kiev and other regions of Ukraine. And, of course, the main promoters of these fears are local elite of Donbass, and they use all these old stereotypes or archetypes of fear inherited from the times of Soviet propaganda during the Second World War, when Galicians were depicted as the collaborators of Nazis, as participants of many Nazi atrocities, and so on. Is it possible to compare situation in Donbass identity and Ural identity and their opposition to center, that is to Moscow and Kiev? Yes. I think that it can be a fruitful comparison, but there is a difference evident for me, because in Russia there is a mainstream, main historical narrative shared in different regions, with Moscow or sometimes Petersburg as center of Russian statehood and nationhood, and Donbass historical myth memories were mostly part of Russian imperial grand narrative and then Soviet imperial grand narrative, because in Russian and Soviet grand narratives, Donbass played a very important role as southern industrial equivalent to Petersburg, for example, from their local point of view. And now Donbass elite, I think, they are looking for Donbass place in Ukrainian historical narrative. And I know example when a member of parliament from the Party of Regions 1 year ago, he published his own history of Ukraine, where Russian imperial and Soviet past is described as more positive than in traditional Ukrainian nationalistic narratives. And even in the 1990s, historical textbook written by historians from Donetsk State University and published in 1999, even in this textbook of history of Ukraine, they emphasized the leading role of Donbass in accordance with this theory of modernization, that the main part, that Donbass as the most industrialized region played the main role in modernization of Ukraine and created conditions for modern nation building, that is, to oppose Galician leading role in Ukrainian historical narratives. And this second question was about this 90% support in Galicia for Yushchenko and Tymoshenko, and 90% support for Yanukovych in Donbass.
Rather, the question was about the sources of stereotypes, how universally shared are these stereotypes you discussed.
Shared by the population
yes,
of respective regions.
Yes.
It's not my research. I can recommend to everyone to use for these purposes a special issue of Lviv-based journal Ukraina Moderna, that is Modern Ukraine, where I think almost half of articles were published in English and some in Ukrainian, but most interesting for my present paper were published in English by Victoria Sereda, social scientist from Lviv, and British scholar, I don't remember his name. Both articles were devoted to these regional stereotypes and of perception of self-identity in cities of Lviv and Donetsk, and based on sociological surveys conducted in 1994, 99 and 2004. And for me, this 90% support for Yanukovych in Donbass and for Yushchenko in Galicia was just starting point to ask my questions. Why so high level in these two regions? Why, namely, these two regions are extreme poles? Why in other regions, even in neighbor regions, the support is only 60% or 55%, but not 90% or 95% sometimes. And why history agenda is so important in Ukrainian political life, and is it possible for other or new politicians to change this agenda? And for my opinion, there is no difference, at least no visible for electorate difference in economic agenda or in social politics between the main political parties in Ukraine, because our political parties mostly represent economic interest of tycoons and not connected with certain social groups and strata. And main political parties in Ukraine presented in the Ukrainian parliament, they use this populism during every electoral campaign, and only resource to emphasize difference between these parties and to establish a connection between party and certain group of electorate is to use history, to use these divisive issues of regional identities, different visions of past, mostly of the more traumatic period that is 20th century. And of course, there are some politicians who never use this historical agenda in their rhetoric, like Yulia Tymoshenko itself, but some her political allies, of course, they use historical issues, but Tymoshenko herself never use these hot issues, and now she is in prison for 7 years. And next person is politicians from Dnipropetrovsk, very important city in Ukraine, because Kuchma started his career from Dnipropetrovsk, and Tymoshenko also. I mean Serhiy Tihipko. He was third in last presidential elections in Ukraine with 13% of support, and now 2 months ago he and his party, Strong Ukraine, they joined Party of Regions, and now he became a member of Party of Regions. And the third person, Arseniy Yatsenyuk, who was on the fourth position during last presidential elections with 7% of support. He also never used these divisive issues, and starting from October or November of 2011, he's absent in all the TV channels.
Yeah. Answer your questions. We have a second round coming up.
So I should be brief, right? Okay.
Well, no, take your time. We have a number of questions, but then we'll have to keep in mind we have the second round.
Okay, so the first one was about the relationship between nationality policy and territory. In a way, why is there no, say, autonomous region in Western Ukraine? I think it's it's actually a key question, which I hope in my work as a whole is answered more thoroughly. Very briefly put, I've come to try to historicize precisely that question. What happens in what is turned in many ways into Western Ukraine after 1939, if you want to have a very quick idea, there's a document, 1939, by the Central Committee in Kiev, which mentions Western Ukraine, and the adjective in front of this term is former. The former Western Ukraine, this and this and this. By 1989, which is the last major anniversary of the liberation celebrated in the then still existing Soviet Union, the head of the OPCOM in Lviv at that time, who also, by the way, is a member of the Central Committee in Kiev, so that's Pokhrivnyak, a fairly important man, gives a speech. The speech is very interesting for many reasons, partly because it has, it makes concessions to perestroika, it revises the way that Soviet power was established, of course not completely, but one very interesting thing is that he very clearly says the peculiarities of our Western Ukrainian region, and so on and so on and so on. So there is something occurring, and this is symptomatic. This is not a freakish accident, this is very symptomatic. Something happens during Soviet rule. It begins with an ambiguous situation where Soviet rule actually seems to at least consider the option, I don't think they really think it's true, but the option is there of making Western Ukraine just another homogenized part, if such things do exist, at least officially, of Soviet Ukraine, and somehow it clearly ends up with having an idea that this region is special. And you will find also Soviet publications by the 80s, Soviet official publications that say that Lviv is the leader of Western Ukraine. Western Ukraine is not autonomous, it's a number of oblasts. It doesn't in that sense exist on a map, but it's clearly somehow there. And it's a problem of scale. It's not an autonomous region, it's not national, but it's not just like the West. And the story that I'm telling is partly how this happens. And my very short answer is that what happens is that, especially after 44, Soviet policy relies fundamentally on the concept of the local. There are other important identities, such as, of course, Komsomol, party, intelligentsia, old intelligentsia, worker peasant, and so on, kolkhoznik later, or kolkhoznik, but the local is everywhere. And you see it in the internal documents, and you see it partly in public discourse. The local is pervasive. And I would argue, and I argue in the book, that the local is invented as a transitory category. The local is invented to go away. You actually call people local so that they learn not to be local anymore. They have to catch up with the rest of the Soviet Union, the rest of Soviet Ukraine, and then they will be like the rest. And what happens sometime between 53 and 56, 60, I think there is a hinge period that one can identify. And this is partly about this. It's an epiphenomenon, what I'm describing in this short paper, is that this transitory category becomes solidified. This never happens officially, of course. In a way, it's paradoxical because it's less mentioned after about 1960. But I think it has actually become entrenched. So that's a very short answer. I mean, one should say more about this, but you know.
If I can just speak one word in here, is that I've been struggling several times. We sometimes think that the clear high modernist engineering scheme is the politics. This is, we understand as a violence, as a politics, as a volition, as subjectivity. Whereas uncertainty and ambiguity, we usually do not understand it the way. You know, I've argued several times that we need to think of both of the situations and strategic dispositions as particular political stances and political resources.
Yes. If I understand you rightly, let me put it like this. If the understanding of Stalinist and Soviet policies is nothing but clarity, this is clearly a case in which that's sacrificed. The clarity somehow goes overboard. But it's not a case that fits into Ukrainian national post-Soviet narrative. What I do not accept is the idea that all of this is because of successful Western Ukrainian Galician resistance persistence. That's the national narrative which I actually also reject. What you have here is a coming together of actually two lethally hostile forces, and they somehow produce this thing together. And none of them really planned this, you know. But that's the picture. How different is it from Eastern Europe, Soviet West? I would say the Soviet West. You know, partly it corresponds to this question. I think partly it's not so different. So, you know, the difference between, say, the Baltics, who have their own republics, and this, in that respect, is not so great. There are, of course, important differences, and we would have to go into this. But if one seeks the difference in either total homogenization into this big Soviet Ukrainian republic, or some form of particularity as a Baltic republic, then you have to relativize this. At least that would be my result. Although there are, of course, other differences. Backtalk of regional. I think the backdrop of the regional here really is Ukraine. Very important. It's very much a Soviet-Ukrainian story. There are Russians there are a lot of Russified so-called Easterners. But the more you look at it, and the statistics tell you the same story, over the Soviet period, Lviv becomes a more and more and more Ukrainian city. There is a hiatus in the 50s, 59 I think, where you have about 25% of the population Russians. Now the big story for me is not that there are these 25%. You can easily explain this by the way that the after-war period is dead. The big story is, why are they a small minority? By the end of the Soviet period, why are 92% of inhabitants of Lviv identifying Ukrainian as their native language by the end, not after the Soviet period? The story of Lviv is a story of Ukrainization, again, not of resistance and so on and so on. So that's the Ukrainian. I see this as the most important thing. Why so many identity studies of Ukraine? I don't know. I really don't. I don't know. I could think. I'm sure it's an excellent question and it points to very important things. But you know, but I cannot think of a good answer right now. And Gruzin's unfortunately the same. I mean, you know, it's again a very important question. Gruzin's, I do think, are not important. I have to say that for the region that I study, but they would be important for Transcarpathia, of course, very much. But I can't really tell you. It's pure.
All right, to the next round of questions. Sergey, Vera, Marina, Ilya, and Ilya.
I have 1.5 questions for Tarik. Tarik, I like very much your very textured sort of study of how Lviv was made Soviet, and of course it reminded me another study of how another Soviet city was built, which is to say like Steve Kovkin's Steel Town. And I'm curious about one difference. Like if you read Steve's book, so it's very clear there that he provides a very exemplary case for Foucauldian understanding of power, right? So when power is repressive, but also power is productive. So basically you have a certain subjectivity formed by sort of an instrument of power. It's enabling, in other words, right? So, and because it's enabling, so you get all kinds of modalities of iterability that are not predictable. You retain sort of the same idea of studying a particular city as an example, but sort of there is a fundamental shift. So you get, and I'm curious about your understanding of power. So like your power is not productive at all. It's interesting, sort of power can be very much totalitarian, and your whole discourse has moved into the idea of the narrative of victim studies, like Victim Snyder and all that kind of stuff. I'm just curious, like sort of what actually is going on here. Like, is it because this neo-totalitarian model becomes more important, sort of more kind of attractive for a new generation of historians? Or is it the material that kind of sort of appeals to this particular way of interpreting it? Just if you could comment on that.
I actually want to return again to Sasha Simeonov's first excellent question. You start answering it by kind of universalizing, if I understood you correctly, the Western Ukrainian case, and I wonder whether we can go into the opposite direction of kind of specifying or exceptionalizing it. Do we have any other case within the Soviet space of regional issue interacting in the same way with a national issue, where you have clear, very strong kind of regional differences, but ethnicity, it doesn't run kind of across ethnic boundaries? Or not? So is it actually something specific here? And how, let's say, important is it in the production of a particular narrative of the past, like the difference with the Baltic states, where this part of the world at some point was, in the modern period, part of the Russian Empire, and obviously Western Ukraine really was the only part of the Soviet Union which wasn't the part of the Tsarist Empire, because Bessarabia was Moldova and in the Baltic states war, and whether maybe the parallel we can universalize the case by looking at the Baltic, the Balkans. So maybe there will be something comparable there. And then you touched upon a question which I kind of thought about in the kind of Russian context or the central context in 1960s and 70s, we have a kind of expression of non-Marxist or actually at times anti-communist nationalist ideas through the concept of malaya rodina, small homeland, sort of focusing on the local. And this is actually something pre-revolutionary concept, which then kind of is rediscovered by, let's say, Russian intellectuals in the 60s. So does this play a role, this interest into the local, in this local kind of specificity in the 60s and 70s? And so you know, who are actually your actors, if you can say a little bit more, and how they change through different periods of Soviet history?
Actually, my question just being asked by Sergei, because I also wanted to ask about the productive aspect of power, and also was thinking about Kotkin's book, but also when Vera mentioned the question about actors, I kind of said, well, okay, so I have no question anymore. But I've actually been thinking about another aspect of this problem of productive aspect of power in connection with these two presentations and maybe placing them into the larger context. So whenever we have studies of self-mythologies and self-image, regional image production in the imperial context, pre-revolutionary context, and I'm thinking, for example, about Ritzart's biography of Franco. We have this agent whose choices are limited by the available discourses, but they at least have some freedom to choose. Then we have your presentation, and some agents are there, especially, well, it becomes very interesting when we learn about people who came from eastern Ukraine and produced this new idea of locality and the idea of western Ukraine as a region. And in this presentation, we already have this monolithic discourse and actually no freedom left, and we have this kinds of terms as population, as regions, as you never specified what kind of elites you mean in particular case, or what kind of population groups you are talking about. So my question is whether we are really talking here about different times or different periods, or this is a kind of methodological problem, or your understanding of power and discourse.
Well, thank you. I read this panel through the prism of the first panel. Yeah, so there was time before lunch. Most of you don't remember this, but other times, same place. So, and it seemed that we outlined this model of exceptionalism as a meta language of intermediation. It is paradoxical, but we know that nationalists in different countries surprisingly well connect to each other and very sympathetic to each other, usually. It's not their immediate neighbors. Fascists, nationalists, all kind of exceptionalist folks. So now we know that, now I see that exceptionalism can work both ways. It can facilitate representation of the locality, or at the same time probably alienate. Now, my question to both of you, or to all of us, I just think I've been thinking why. But think about the Ottoman Empire. I mean, there are regions, historical regions, with such strong identity and mythologies of identities, like Mesopotamia, Egypt, early in the 19th century in particular, Anatolia. They're very exceptional. There are narratives of exceptionalism. Yet somehow, this exceptionalism, in this case, indeed worked as a, interface for connectivity, for something bigger. Why it's a different temporality? Why in Ukraine this exceptionalism of Donbass and exceptionalism of Galicia? Why? Not why don't they produce, but what would it take to produce this, for them to work? What is missing? What element is missing to produce this common Ukraine out of these exceptionalism that now seem to more to alienate than to integrate these regions, historical regions.
Two short commentaries. First, for Tarik. Correct me if I'm mistaken, but it seems to me when I think about your presentation, about your paper, that the image of Lviv in Soviet propaganda was prefaced for all the Soviet Union. The seizure of Western Ukraine and Western Belarus was presented in propaganda as the return of lost territories. It was in propaganda the term reunification, воссоединение was used, and this principle differs. This situation principally differs from the propaganda situation with Baltic states. The Baltic states was states also returning, so to say, but it was returning whole nations, whole cultures. It was returning, so to say, of old friends, and the reunifications. You may see the immortal poem by Natalia Mikhalkova-Krичевская, «Наша древняя столица», and then this propaganda picture is very well seen. And in the case of Western Ukraine and Western Belarus, propaganda for all the Soviet Union presented them as the return of imprisoned relatives. And for the propaganda for Lviv was the propaganda presented the image of heroical survival of Lviv, of Colonel Yaroslav Halan before his death.
Thank you. One more question, Stephen.
Question to both of you, if I may. I think both papers mentioned in passing the role of expatriates, diaspora communities, which is particularly interesting to those of us who are probably in danger of thinking that Ukraine is really a province of North America, somewhere between Saskatoon and Cleveland, with a few outposts in southeast England. Could you perhaps say a little more about how important and what has been distinctive about the role of Ukrainian expatriate communities in the image creations and memory wars that you're talking about?
Thank you. One more brief question.
Even it is not a question, just an afterword to what has been said already. So, and I would return to first what Sasha said at the beginning, which is really a very interesting question, and then to Vera's point. And actually, I think that this aspect of temporality is really important for the Soviet story. And of course, the Moldovan story is missing here, so I have almost the obligation to fill in some. I'm joking now, but anyway, what I'm thinking about is that you were talking about how they were trying to integrate Lviv in this Soviet end of history scheme, and about these borderlines or temporal lines during the 20th century. And I wonder, and that is also a broader methodological question, if you wish, could we talk about a special temporal essence or characteristics of the peripheries, in the Western peripheries, but not only maybe, in the Soviet context? Because, yes, after 1945, they were integrated into this Soviet success story, but they had all these multiple paths that you had to deal with, and they were not comfortable at all sometimes. And maybe these, and again I agree with that, this trend, which also is verified in the Moldovan case, when this transitory category of, almost local folkloric almost identity somehow solidified and became self-propelling in the later period, the 60s and 70s. But maybe this also has to do with this notion of Soviet temporality applied to the Borderlands. So, and secondly, really very brief, and again, that's why I was referring to this question about actors, because if you use institutional analysis, to what extent did you use institutional analysis? You mentioned this case of Belayev and the controversies within the Writers' Union, and I immediately popped into my mind that in Moldova you had these very interesting conflicts between the Bessarabian and the Transnistrian groups that really have, if you analyze them institutionally, then you see all these workings of, compromise, collaboration, distribution of power resources connected to the national canon and all this. So I wonder if there is also, an institutional analysis gives us a different perspective.
All right, we have about between 15 and 20 minutes to answer all these questions. Let's give it a try.
So I pick out only a few because otherwise it's I think too many. Comparison with or the reference to Magnetic Mountain and problem of studies focusing on victimization versus the perspective on enabling or productive power, totalitarianism. This is partly, and this also, Marina prefers actually to your comments, this is really partly due to the massive aggregation going into this. In fact, what I'm trying to do in this book is to synthesize the two. It's really a dichotomy that I try not to let apply to my story. It's clearly also an enabling and a very productive power, and at the same time it's extremely victimizing. And it's also under Stalin, I would follow Emil Weiner and always plead for totalitarianism as a very valid approach. Still, it makes sense. After Stalin, of course, it's a very different story. But that's exactly the point about Stalinism, that it can be extremely victimizing, and at the same time it can be enabling. That's actually the way I read Kotkin too. It's partly an extremely grim story of Magnitogorsk too, with plenty of victimization thrown in. But what he manages to do in the same book is he explains to us that that doesn't mean that it cannot also be productive in the way you mentioned. And I see it very much in a similar way. When you look at what happens, for example, after the killing of Halan in October 49, it's both. It's a massive repression campaign, it's very cruel, and at the same time it's a massive cooptation campaign. And both of them work, and you can trace it through the Komsomol, you can trace it through the purge meetings at the university, the data is all there, and they go absolutely together. And when you find the head of the propaganda agitation department of the Kiev Central Committee speaking in Lviv in 1950, Ivan Nazarenko, he says it very, very clearly. He doesn't put it quite in these words, but it's really easy to read what he says as saying that there is no contradiction. This is the same, this is the real dialectic of Stalinism. You can have it both. You can massively terrorize people, and at the same time you can also make them an offer to join. And both things happen. And the problem in national narratives now in Western Ukraine is that the joining has to be repressed. The joining cannot be remembered. So in that sense, actually, when I look, for example, at the old intelligentsia, what I'm describing is a group of people who are always described as victims. But in fact, they're thriving after 1953, 1954. All of them. One of them doesn't survive long enough, he dies in 54 to really enjoy it. The others have real careers. Before that, they're being hounded. But at the same time, they're never destroyed. Some other people, very similar to them, are destroyed. So again, that's not a simple story. But there are definitely people who experience both of these aspects in their biographies. And for me, this is, I mean, the conundrum of Stalinism, that you have to think together the victimization and the participation. I mean, I would refer to a German term which has been used by Klagenborg, I think. It's a Mitmachgesellschaft. It's at the same time terroristic and in a society that invites you to participate. And both works. And it works in Western Ukraine too, whatever the national mythology, it works very well. The thing that, the Baltics, the point about the Baltics that I didn't think about and that one should perhaps mention is there is something very odd when you compare the Baltics and Western Ukraine. Western Belarus, I'm not so sure. It's actually maybe a different case again. The Baltics, which is often forgotten, yes, they were part of the Russian Empire, but in the interwar period they also have a history, a real substantial history of state sovereignty, and it matters. There are elites and there are populations that learn about sovereignty and they practice it. Western Ukraine doesn't have that, but it has a very long history of a nationalism that wants state sovereignty in a complicated way. By the 1930s, clearly in a fascist way, the Western Ukrainian nationalist movement, or then the UN and UPA and so on, are very, very fascist by the time of the Second World War. I know that, again, that's complicated, but I think that is really something one has to see. But they are into sovereignty, very, very much. That's why they declare a state in 41, which the Germans then don't give them, which is the reason why Ronald Reagan can actually receive status quo in the 1980s, because they were lucky. They didn't get the Ustashir state that they actually wanted, but that's another thing. So there are ways in which I think, even if you look at the Western Ukrainian case as very different from the Baltics, there is something that it has in common with the Baltics, which is that the Soviets have to somehow deal with elites that have very strong ideas about sovereignty, alternative sovereignties to theirs. And then they deal with those in different ways, I think. Actors, you're talking about, again, in this paper it looks like a monolithic story and, very few choices, very few actors. When, if we had time for the chapter, it's a completely different story. What it actually is a story in which the stories that I describe here are not just being written, they're actually being co-written. And they're, for example, co-written by people who were in the Narodnya Gvardia, and they fight amongst each other. And part of Soviet power comes out of the fact that the Obkom becomes actually the court of appeal. And also the intelligentsia, of course, they are also fighting amongst each other. But you've seen here Melnichuk, Kozlanyuk, Belyayev, that's only a small fragment. Again and again, there is a way in which you can very clearly trace how people participate in these Soviet processes that do generate Soviet power. And of course, this is very important. And that means there are choices. I don't like this expression usually because it's usually a cop-out, but it's a sort of spectrum of choices. There are some really choiceless choices in these situations too, although that comes from a different historiography, I know, and they are not very frequent here. And there are a lot of more choices where people can actually do certain things. To give you one example, one of the people who's hounded from 1947 really is a literature scholar. They tell him go to Kiev, leave Lviv. He doesn't go. He's not treated worse than any of the others, those who go. Those who go, you will now find in national narratives in Ukraine being described as deported. In these, there were people deported, but in these cases nothing of the sort took place. They were put under pressure to leave for Kiev, live there. They actually spent most of the year then in Lviv, de facto, and Ukrainian historians who have worked on that. But they adapted. They adapted because of careers, because of pressure, and so on and so on. This one didn't. So there were choices. In the end, the outcomes in these cases are relatively similar. And of course, there are much more dramatic choices which have to do with resistance, non-resistance, nationalism, very often also for working both sides, religion, and so on. The image in Soviet propaganda, yes, you're totally right. It's an image, but one has to say one thing. It's not just return of brothers who have been oppressed by Poles in this case. It's also liberation from centuries of social bondage. That's very much sold to, and its modernization. From the very beginning, Soviet propaganda stresses that it's not just liberating these people socially and nationally, it's also bringing them the modern world. And you find very, very clear statements from Khrushchev downwards telling you that, they're seeing tractors for the same time, and so on and so on. You could go into this, it's a whole discourse of modernity actually meeting the backward in the West, which is partly why this is such an interesting story, because it's an inversion of the gradient. And I think it's quite consciously done on the Soviet side, and with great pride. Diaspora, yes, diaspora is extremely important. It's a huge topic in itself. It's true. I mean, it's all over the place, especially by the 1970s. You will find a lot of Soviet writing actually addressed to the influence of the diaspora. It happens earlier to Halam, for example, writes a whole play about the diaspora and how dangerous it is, but then sitting in the DP camps in Germany and so on. And of course, then later you also get diaspora influence coming back in, and it's extremely important now. And it's one would have to talk about separately, but it's definitely a huge factor. Is there Borderlands special temporality? Yeah, I would think yes. And I would think one should actually expand this and look at the different temporalities between what we call the Soviet West territories that were taken into the Soviet Union and what we sometimes call the Outer Empire, or what used to be called the Eastern Bloc. And they're very clearly different, and you can actually trace this beautifully in the case of Western Ukraine. If you were in Eastern Europe outside the Soviet Union, you could have a bourgeois democratic revolution in 1918. At the end of the war, something could happen during the collapse of the Habsburg Empire that would be called in Soviet historiography, well, this was sort of bourgeois democratic, Menshevik, whatever. Not the real thing, but there they could have that. In Lviv, Western Ukraine, which of course in reality was part of that word, right? That's the Habsburg word. Exactly that version is not allowed. And there's an extremely interesting, really liminal discussion by Valentin Malanchuk, who is an important propaganda and agitation person, who says it very, very clearly. There are certain things that are discussini and certain things that are not discussini. And this precisely is what's not discussini, because that would put them on a different temporal trajectory. That would smash the special relationship with 1917 they need to have because they're inside Soviet borders.
There are two questions. First is about definition of regional elites in Donbass and Galicia. And in the Soviet era, of course, there were two big groups of regional elites, that is Communist Party, regional leadership, and so-called red directors, the directors of the main plants and factories. And of course, since Donbass was more industrialized and more loyal to the Moscow communist government, the red directors were more important in Donbass, and Communist Party leaders were more important in Western Ukraine. Then, during Perestroika and early independence, some dissident leaders became leaders of the Narodny Ruch in Western Ukraine, mostly in Galicia, 3 oblasts. But later, many former communist members, many red directors joined Narodny Ruch as the main party, as the dominant political party in Galicia, and became leaders of Narodny Ruch and some other so-called national democratic parties with main electoral base in Western Ukraine. And in Donbass, in 1990s, mostly local inhabitants mostly voted for the renovated Communist Party because leader of the Communist Party of Ukraine, Petro Simonenko, he was born in Donetsk and was perceived as our candidate, as our guy by the local population. And at the same time, during the process of privatization of state factories and plants, many red directors became owners of these plants and factories, and they, at the end of 1990s, they founded their own party of regions, and at the parliamentary elections in 1998, this party of new bourgeoisie of Donbass, they push out Communist Party from Donbass, and the Communist Party lost its support dramatically in Donbass, and from this late 1990s, Donbass is politically dominated by this party of region, which is almost only one party, because other parties have not opportunity, in particular before Orange Revolution, to act freely in this region. And some of regional elite in Donbass, they never was red directors, such tycoons as Renat Akhmetov, they never explained the sources of their state, yes, and yes, no one asked such questions to them, and there is a suspicion that this part of Donbass regional elite has strong connections with criminality at the beginning of their business career. And the second question was about influence of diaspora communities in Ukrainian political life. And these Ukrainians, citizens of the United States and Canada, they're mostly descendants of immigrants from Galicia, and many of them are sons and grandsons of those Galicians who migrated from Western Ukraine during and after World War II. And many of them were accused not only by Soviet propaganda but also by international Jewish organizations as participants of Nazi atrocities and Holocaust in particular. And for my opinion, there is a struggle between Ukrainian diasporas and Jewish diasporas in Northern America, who is the main victim of Nazi regime or Stalinist regime. And just one example why issue of Great Famine or Holodomor is so important, and Ukrainian diasporas in Canada and United States are main promoters of this new vision of Great Famine. The first question is why the figure of victims of Holodomor is so important. At the very beginning of discussion of these issues, before any academic research of this problem, there was a figure of 7 million of Ukrainian victims of Holodomor. And even after research conducted during the presidency of Yushchenko, there were a figure only of 2.5 million of victims known by their names. It's not satisfied diaspora. They want a figure from 7 to 10 millions, because 7 millions is more than 6 millions of Jews killed during Holocaust. And the second question, why the definition of the Great Famine as genocide is so important for Yushchenko and for Ukrainian diaspora. By the same reason, because these descendants of Ukrainians, Galicians, who migrated after the World War II, they want to rehabilitate their fathers and grandfathers and to shift attention from Nazi atrocities to Stalinism atrocities, and to emphasize that Ukrainians were also victims of genocide in 1933 Ukrainians. And I think the same situation is in many parts of Western borderland of former Soviet Union, because the same museums of genocide, commissions to study genocide were founded in Baltic states, in Lithuania, in Estonia, and museums of Soviet occupation in Georgia and in some Baltic states. And I think that genocide in these post-communist societies is very popular to accuse Stalinism and to equal crimes of Hitler and Stalin, and this is part of this big competition between different diasporas based in Northern America.
Right, thanks a lot. Let's thank our presenters. Remember that we reconvene after the break, the coffee break at 4:30.